Church camp is very exhausting. You're basically up at 7 a.m. and you go till after midnight most of the time. And so there's just always something happening. There's like no downtime. And anytime you're with youth, I don't know where they get all that energy. But you have to just pull out reserves you didn't know you had just to try and keep up. But the week goes by really fast because you're always doing something. So there's always something happening. So the time goes by really quickly. And of course, camp just feels like holy ground. It's so easy to feel the Spirit of God present in everything that you're doing. And really, church camp, it's different from the rest of the world. In some ways, that's a good thing. Of course, in other ways, I'm not sure if the rest of the world were like camp, I could handle the exhaustion that I would have. One of the things I really love about camp, though, is the way everyone is comfortable to just be who they are. And everyone else accepts them. And there's not as much judgment at church camp as there is in the real world. Our scripture this morning is one that we actually used this week in camp. It was one of the scriptures of one of our days at camp. Now remember, of course, this is sex camp. And so we learned all about the male reproductive system on Monday and the female reproductive system on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, after having learned about the female reproductive system, this was one of our scriptures. And so we were able to kind of understand a little bit about the woman and the hemorrhaging because we learned the things that we had learned the day before. But while I was at camp, I started thinking as we listened to the scriptures and we kind of went through Jesus' life a little bit through camp. And I started thinking, I bet being one of the disciples and traveling with Jesus felt a little bit like church camp. I mean, Jesus was always on the move, especially if we're in the Gospel of Mark, which uses the word immediately so many times. It was in there. It was in our scripture this morning a few times even. Mark uses immediately all the time. Always, immediately Jesus was doing this, and then immediately this happened. They're always on the move. It kind of does make it a little bit more gives me a little bit more understanding on why at the end of the Gospel, when Jesus goes into Gethsemane to pray, the disciples couldn't stay awake. Because I identify with that inability to stay awake. But I really, in this scripture, sense the connections between Jesus and camp. Because as we went through camp, we were never able to keep to our schedule. Something always came up that threw us off schedule, whether it was weather or something else that became more important in the moment that we need to stick with this and see this through. And so we'll push what was next back a little bit. And that feels like what's happening here in our scripture. I don't know exactly what Jesus' plan was when he gets back to the Jewish side of the sea at the beginning of our scripture, but he is immediately beset with a problem. As one of the leaders of the synagogue comes to him and says, "My daughter is at the point of death. I need you to come with me." So whatever it was that they were supposed to do, that the schedule said was supposed to happen right then, was pushed aside because there was a little girl on the point of death. And so they set to deal with that problem when they get interrupted again. It seems to me that Jerry is the only non-main character that gets named in this, which I think is kind of interesting since it's the two women that have the issues, but it's the man that gets the name. I wonder what he was thinking when Jesus stops after somebody touches him. I can imagine that he's pretty upset because he feels like he has a pretty pressing need. And maybe on the surface to us, too, we can kind of see, like, why is this that important? She's been sick for 12 years. She can hang on a little bit longer. We've got a little girl that's about to die. If we don't hurry, it might be too late. And in fact, we find out just after our little interlude here with this other woman that it is too late. She died while this interruption was taking place. Mark loves to do this. He loves to start a story, interrupt with a different story, and then go back to the original story. And he does that because he wants us to look at the two stories in concert with one another. We need to see the connections of the two stories in order to get the whole picture that Mark wants us to get. So I think one of the things that's interesting is to look and see what are some of the similarities and what are some of the contradictions in the two stories. And I mentioned already that we have a named male, Jairus, and then we have no idea what this woman's name is that comes in need of healing. And then the woman herself, actually, she needs the healing, whereas Jairus comes for his daughter, for someone else. We have the rich and powerful Jairus, and we have the poor, because she spent all of her money on trying to be cured, and the unclean woman. We have the asked for in public. Jairus comes forward and asks Jesus, please come and heal. And then we have the quietly trying to get the healing on the side without anyone else noticing. So, and it's interesting that Jairus asks in public, but you notice when the healing happens, Jesus kicked everybody else out and the healing happened in private. Whereas the woman tries to get her healing in private, but Jesus takes it and makes it public. And then there are a lot of similarities. The woman had been sick, had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. And at the end, we find out that the young girl is 12 years old. Both in the story are referred to as daughter. Jairus calls his daughter, and Jesus, after healing the woman, refers to her as daughter. Both, when Jesus touches them, are unclean. The woman is unclean because in that time, in Jewish tradition, we could look in Leviticus if we wanted to and find the scripture, when you were bleeding, when you were having your period, when you were on your menstrual cycle, and those things, you were unclean for that period of time. And you had to go through a ritual to become clean again once you were done. And anyone that you touched or that touched you while that was going on was also unclean and had to go through the ritual in order to get clean. If she had sat down somewhere while on her period, had gotten up, and somebody else came down and sat in the same seat, that person was then unclean until they went through the ritual to get clean. So, imagine how annoying that would be for the few days, a month. And now realize this had been 12 years. And the little girl, when Jesus touched and healed her, was unclean because she was dead. Dead flesh was unclean. In order to touch anything dead, that would make you unclean, and you would have to go through a ritual in order to once again be clean. So both were in the moment that Jesus touched them unclean. So let's look a little bit now in particular at the stories. And let's look first at the woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. I think it's interesting that Jesus was in the middle of a crowd, probably jostling, walking tightly together. People were being bumped. I love how the disciples, when Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" The disciples are like, "Really?" Like, we're surrounded by people. You can't not be touched. I immediately, as I read this, think of right after the Cubs won the World Series, and I spilled out into Wrigleyville. I'm right there. This was from a helicopter that took a photo just after we won the World Series. It was insane. And everyone was trying to go, and I was trying to make my way to the marquee, because I was in a bar just next to Wrigley Field. And so I'm trying to go to get a picture of the marquee because they changed it to say World Series champions. And everyone was trying to do that. And if you weren't already right by the stadium, they actually put us on the bar through the alley, because they'd already closed off right around the stadium. So you see that little partition of people there? So I'm just on the other side of that, fighting my way up front so I can get a picture of the marquee, when that helicopter came over and took our picture. And if you had asked me to tell you who had just touched me, or who I had just touched, I have no idea. There were 2 million people around. And I know that that's what the disciples are thinking right now. They're like, really? And yet, despite all those people touching Jesus and that Jesus is touching, somehow, only one of them is healed. And when it happens, Jesus knows. Touch is important. Being able to touch others and be touched. Friday night after worship, it's a very meaningful worship service the last night of Aiders Camp. We do an actual foot washing. And we wash all the feet of the kids in our small group. And as we do so, we give them an affirmation. And after that worship service, one of the kids came up to me and just gave me a big hug with tears on her face. The ability to know that you're loved and to know that you can love others. Touch is so important. So what must it have been like for that woman who for 12 years couldn't touch anyone and couldn't be touched by anyone without making them unclean? So if she was married, she most likely was married, she couldn't show affection towards her husband, especially because they'd already spent all their money trying to find a cure for this. So he was probably having to work even more than normal to make up for the money they'd already spent and find a way to get more money in order to see if they could get her help. And if she touched him, he's out. There's nothing you can do because it's a 24+ hour cycle to get yourself clean again. What courage must it have taken for her to go into a crowd looking for anything to heal herself? Because she knows if she gets caught touching people in a crowd, touching someone like Jesus, she's potentially turning all of them unclean. I mean, that's something she could probably be killed for. Going out of her way to make these people unclean on the bare smallest chance that maybe this Jesus could heal her. You know, especially with the rhetoric we have today, we wonder, why? Why are people even trying to come to America? How bad must their situation be if coming to a country where the primary talk at the highest levels of government is how those coming to this country are only coming to take jobs or bring violence and crime? How bad must the situation be to make you risk going there? What desperation she must have felt to take this risk. And she does get caught. How scared she must have been to come forward and admit that she had touched Jesus. And it says she told her whole story. And Jesus commends her on her faith. God can work miracles through our own risk-taking, through our own initiative. And while this moment is happening, here come the family saying, well, don't bother him anymore, it's too late. She's dead. And so we must wonder, at this point in the story, will death be the death of the hope and the faith that Jairus had? When we just saw this woman's faith rewarded, are we seeing the death of this man's faith? But Jesus tells him to have faith, to continue having faith. Show an active faith like this woman just did. And Jesus gets to the house, and everyone is weeping and wailing, which was a traditional Jewish sign to mourn the passing of someone. They weren't just being dramatic. They were following through with their faithful showing of love for this now departed girl. And yet Jesus uses eschatological language of the end time, and says she's not dead, she's only sleeping. Pointing out, not that, no, you got it wrong, she's just asleep, but to say instead that now, death isn't permanent. God's kingdom has broken through the permanence of death. Death is no longer an end. It's just like sleeping, or the resurrection will come to all of us. The way that these two miracles interact together really have something to say to us. What it feels like when you see miracles happen in the world for others, while it seems like the miracle you need is not occurring. Why is God working there while ignoring my needs? And I feel like that's maybe something that Jairus was feeling in that moment as he sees this woman get cured while his daughter lays dying. But we can't know what needs others have, even when our own seem dire. Because, sure, that woman wasn't dead, but wasn't she? If you couldn't have human contact for 12 years, in a way, hasn't she been dead the entire time that girl has been alive? And then we see that it's never too late for God to intervene. Even when it seems like it's too late, it's never too late for God to intervene. We see that sometimes we need to act ourselves in order to find God's miraculous works in our lives. But then also, it's not like this woman for the last 12 years hadn't been acting towards her own healing. The scripture tells us she had. She'd spent everything she had. She'd been, who knows to how many people, trying to find a cure. So just because you've been active trying to bring about God's miracle, it doesn't mean the miracle isn't coming, because it is never too late for God to intervene. And finally, I talked about when you come in contact with someone who is unclean, you have to go through a cleaning ritual yourself. Notice Jesus doesn't do that. Rather than the unclean person making Jesus also unclean, the power of God takes that which is unclean and instantly makes it clean. The woman who'd been hemorrhaging for 12 years, touching Jesus, didn't make Jesus unclean. It made her clean. Jesus touching the dead girl didn't make him unclean. It made her clean. How often do we worry about those who we see as different contaminating us. When instead, if we were doing the work of God, we should be worried about becoming more clean by our interaction with those Jesus calls us to love. This week, one of my small group kids, he was also in my room, he had this little thing that he liked to do where he would take his name tag and wear it in a weird place on his head. Or he'd take a cardboard box and wear it like a hat. And he would do this until someone said, "Why are you doing that?" The problem is we were at church camp, where everyone accepts everything. So he would go hours with his name tag in a weird place waiting for someone to say, "Why are you doing that?" so he could stop doing it. And no one would. Because we're just well, that's Winston. He likes to wear his name tag in a weird place. That's okay. We still love Winston. And so we were talking about it Saturday, and he said, "No one would ever point it out." And I said, "That's because everyone accepts everything here. We don't know that you're doing it because you want it pointed out. We just accept you, even with your name tag, being in a weird place." And he's like, "That makes sense." The woman had no acceptance from society. Jesus made her part of community again. And that's what we're called to do. What happens at church camp should happen in the real world. And maybe it would be worth the exhaustion if the world were more like church camp.